Our scripture for this first Sunday of Advent comes from Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 5. The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." The word of the Lord. How many peace initiatives have been started and inspired by that passage? It's a familiar one. That swords into plowshares imagery is powerful. But we just read the pretty part of this passage. If you keep reading, you're going to see that house of Jacob that was so warmly invited to come and walk in the light is pretty heavily indicted. There are accusations of idolatry, of storing up riches, of what one translation called human haughtiness. Ouch! This passage comes at a moment of history, and that moment of history is a time of warfare and destruction. It's a time when Jerusalem is under siege. Nations were battling to see who was going to be in control, who would be the global superpower of the day. And the poet-prophet of Isaiah seems to blame the leaders of Israel for the calamity. They were idolatrous, improper stewards, seeking wealth and power rather than the welfare of the people. Things were bad. Things were really bad in the world behind this text. As I was preparing for today's sermon, I thought, haven't I said this before? And then I realized that there's kind of a refrain that I find myself saying at some point every year during Advent. I say it or I write it. And it goes something like this. The world was a mess. It was a time of polarization, corrupt leaders, nations occupying other nations, the powerful few holding all the wealth. It was a time when people were fleeing their homes and becoming refugees, a time of fear and change. And that's the world that a baby Savior was born into. Every year, I say it, or I write it, or both, every year. And every year we hear it and think, oh, that could be our world. Every year it rings and sounds familiar because there's always some kind of mess going on. Just like the people in the 7th century BC and the people in the time of Jesus, we in 2022 are living in a world that is tempted by idolatry, where we're tempted to trust in nations and rulers and systems instead of in God, a time of human haughtiness. We're not alone. We're not the first ones to feel this way. Many have gone before and had the same struggles. Each point in history struggling with these age-old temptations of idolatry and holding on to power in its own unique ways. We live in a perpetual mess, and we are in constant need of restoration. It's true now. It was true when Jesus was born. It was true when the prophet Isaiah was speaking these words. And yet, aren't you glad there's a yet? The poet-prophet of Isaiah 2 does not begin with this indictment. The poet-prophet of Isaiah does not begin with describing the mess. This poet-prophet leads with hope. One scholar that I was looking at called it courage of desperation. I prefer imaginative boldness, maybe audacious hope. This is hope that springs from a source that can only be God. In this world of political corruption, the prophet imagines the world with God's dream made real. Instead of being trained to fight, swords are going to be transformed into plowshares. Soldiers become farmers, feeding the people instead of placing them under siege. You hear that? Instead of creating famine, they will solve famine. Nations don't learn war. Instead, they walk in the light of the Lord together. Instead of seeds of corruption being taught, God's wisdom comes forth. Instead of streaming to the distractions of idolatry, the people stream to the mount of the Lord. And instead of putting their trust in nations and rulers and systems, the people put their trust in God. God's instruction will come forth. God will be the judge. The people are getting reoriented toward God. And what I find fascinating is that it's not apocalyptic. That phrase in the beginning, in the days to come or in future days, that doesn't mean some unrealized future. It just means it's not quite here yet. It's coming. It's a process. We'll get there. It's wildly hopeful, boldly imaginative. How do we emulate that hope? Sometimes I think it might mean the kind of big, bold visioning that we did as a church several years ago. But I think more often, more daily, it's less a matter of planning and more a matter of catching the hope in the wind. God, the source of hope, is blowing it around. It's not something that we can fit in a box. It doesn't necessarily fit our notions of what it should look like. Maybe it's not always immediately recognizable, but it's there. And often our job is just to catch on to it and follow it, even if we can't see exactly where it's leading. As I was preparing this sermon, there's a story that kept coming to mind for me. It's one that I learned about on sabbatical. And it has to do with hope in the form of chickens and whistling and bear hugs. My maternal grandparents, Wilbert and Viola Berkey, moved their family of 9 to Bonito, Puerto Rico in 1956. They were going there to serve with the Ulrich Foundation, which is a foundation that many in this church have worked with or known about. Grandpa was going to work with the Poultry Project, so establishing layers and meat birds as one form of sustenance and business in the mountains around Bonito. He hired a 15-year-old named Godofredo to work for him, Godo, as he was more commonly called. Godo had to quit school and get a job. And he needed to do that because his dad had left the family to go to Chicago to find work. But somehow there had not been a lot of communication, and the family was not receiving support from Godo's father. So Godo, at the age of 15, went to work, for the poultry project. He was a good kid, had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and what we might term as church baggage. My grandpa was someone who wore faith on his sleeve. It wasn't that he was constantly trying to convert people, it was just part of his daily language. But he learned really quickly that if he mentioned God, Godo would walk off the job. So Grandpa had to learn to not mention anything about his faith, anything explicitly about God. I think that if my grandpa had just looked at that and tried to play the situation out fully, it would have felt pretty hopeless. Instead, Grandpa caught the hope in the wind and did the next faithful thing. When the family was home in Illinois on furlough, he somehow, we're not sure how, tracked down Godo's father in Chicago and drove there and showed up at his door. He handed Godo's dad a plane ticket, a one-way ticket to Puerto Rico, and said, "You need to go home to your family. And if you go home to your family, I will give you a job until you can find another one." Godo's father used the ticket. He came back to Ay Bonito. He worked for my grandpa and then found another job. However, life continued to be hard for Godo. And that is the last my grandpa knew of the story until 1988. In 1988, my Uncle Merv and his family, my mom's older brother, served in Puerto Rico for a year. They were at Betania, a Mennonite school that, again, is near and dear to some in this congregation. Now, Merv had been warned never to open his door late at night, but he's not always a rule follower. And so one night when someone knocked on the door, he just opened it wide up without thinking. A man walked into his house and said, "Are you Berkey?" And Merv said, "Yes." And the man grabbed him in a bear hug. And he said, "Berkey saved my life." It was Godo. And when my grandpa came to visit a few months later, he did get to learn the rest of the story from Godo. Godo had had a troubled life. And one night in his adulthood, he was in town, completely drunk. He was estranged from his wife and children. And I think we would describe it as hitting rock bottom. Then he heard a familiar melody. See, Grandpa had respected Godo's wishes not to talk about God, but Grandpa was a whistler. So when he was in the chicken houses, he whistled. And what songs did he know? Hymns, right. So that drunken evening, one of those hymns was drifting out on the wind from one of the churches. Godo followed that sound coming on the wind into the church, and he told the pastor that he wanted to be baptized. The pastor told him, "You're drunk, come back when you're sober." And he thought he'd never see him again. But Godo showed up. He got sober. He was reconciled with his family. He worked in the Mennonite hospital there for many years. And he became and remains a faithful member of the Mennonite church at Betania. When my mom, who's here this morning, that's why I keep looking over here, visited the church at Betania for her first time since childhood, Godo came up to her. "Are you Berkey?" When she said yes, he gave her a big bear hug. When we visited the church in May, my uncle, who's good friends with Godo, had told him we would be coming. And Godo smiled at me. "You Berkey?" And I got my own bear hug. He also insisted on buying all of us a chicken dinner, which we ate right beside my mom's first grade classroom. Our boys say that it is the best chicken they've ever had. There was no long-range planning involved in this story of hope. I don't think my grandpa could have played it out like this. There was no strategic plan. There was just God, the source of hope, blowing around a chicken house in a little town. The days to come were not realized for a couple of decades, and the story wasn't fully known until a generation later. But there we were, 2 generations later, filled to the brim with hope in a God of bold imagination. The days to come weren't tomorrow, but they also weren't so far off. A lost boy was restored to his family and to his Creator, and my grandpa got to see hope fulfilled. My children got to experience the power of hope and of acting faithfully, even though they never even knew their great-grandfather. Restoration hope in chickens and whistling and bear hugs. Our theme this Advent season is Restoration is Near. Restoration is a process. I promise the tree is coming. And restoration is perpetual. We partner with God in a constant restoration project. The world always feels a little messy. Doesn't mean the restoration's not happening. It means it continues to happen. It is continuous. We are continuously grinding swords into plowshares, continuously learning peace, perpetually turning our ears away from the siren call of individualism and toward the wisdom of God, constantly redirecting our steps from the ways of idolatry to the mountain of God, always reorienting from trusting in systems and rulers and nations to trusting in God. So take a breath. Look around and breathe in this people of God in all of our messiness. Where is hope in the wind? What next faithful steps can we take to follow that hope? We may not be able to see where hope is leading, and we may not see that until tomorrow or 10 years from now or even 30 years from now. But that's okay. All that is required of us now is that we recognize hope and we follow it. Way back, somewhere around the 7th century BC, a prophet caught the hope in the wind and dared to imagine a world made right. Centuries later, God made the bold move of hope incarnate, coming into the world as a tiny, helpless baby. Thousands of years later, we follow that same glimmer of hope to a manger, to a story that we've come to claim as our own. We follow it to a way that is, at times, audacious, boldly imaginative, often rather messy, full of ridiculous hope. We step into Advent and join in God's work of restoration.